last years of my grandfather Francisco's life were difficult. At some point, it truly seemed he had lost any memory of us. His family, his life, who he was. Slowly we lost him. We moved in with him to take care of him. I think we made his last moments as peaceful as possible, given the circumstances. There were things, though, that unsettled us a bit. He would get up at night, talking to himself. We had to look for him, following his whispers. His dark house could be quite eerie. It's an old house from another era that has belonged to our family for many, many years. Another thing that bothered us was when he would talk to himself in his room and fall silent every time someone entered to ask whom he was speaking with. This was especially strange because he never seemed aware of those around him. It didn't matter who we were or what we thought. He simply wouldn't acknowledge us. That's why it felt odd that, in those moments, he chose to remain silent, to hide whom he was talking to. And, well, when I said it made us uncomfortable, I might have understated it. The truth is, it terrified us to the bone. My grandfather was no longer the same. Last Christmas was the first one we spent without him. He finally passed to a better place, one where he could remember who he was again, where he could reunite with my grandmother and all his family. Finding his letters and incoherent writings from his last months was an experience that left us shaken. It truly seemed as if someone else was inhabiting him. Someone who wasn't the grandfather we knew. Our beloved grandpa. That Christmas we decided to spend it in his house as a tribute, a way to remember him. Once he passed, the house was put up for sale. So we knew it would be the last Christmas in the house where my father and my aunts grew up. He said, eyeing me down. Everyone came. It was a big gathering like we hadn't had since I was a child, since my grandmother was alive. Also, I don't think we'd all come together like that since the funerals. That night before the celebration, on the 23rd at the house, I stayed at the house. I had lived there for the past 2 years, so it was practically my home as well. I felt safe and comfortable, which is why what I heard in the middle of the night caught me by surprise. At first, I thought it was a dream. I heard my grandfather's voice, whispers in the night, like he used to when he had his bad episodes, and would leave his room to hide in some corner. I heard them so vividly that I woke up. For a moment, I forgot my grandfather was already dead. I simply got up, ready to look for him as always. But as I reached the door of my room, I remembered. I woke up completely and attributed it all to my imagination. But the whisper wasn't a dream. A voice, someone, something was there with my grandfather. Something was out there, beyond the door of my room. I opened the door, tried to listen carefully, and looked around. I turned on the hallway light. The living room was in complete darkness, and I didn't dare look directly into it. Yes, I know that night something could have happened. I might have seen something, but I didn't dare. I had never felt such fear. I had never been so certain that the paranormal existed, until that moment. I hadn't felt such fear. I had never been so certain that the paranormal existed. Until that moment, I had never felt such fear. I had never been so certain. Honestly, I didn't run simply because I would have had to cross half the house in the dark. So I stayed awake all night until exhaustion overtook me. The next event happened the following evening during the Christmas Eve gathering with the entire family. My cousin Raul's baby, who was about 11 months old at the time, was left to sleep for a while in my grandfather's room. "Let Grandpa keep an eye on him," said my cousin's wife, jokingly. She placed the baby in his bed, thinking it was the safest spot in the house for him. When the baby cried, we all heard him, but those closest to the room, my cousin Julissa and my brother Aaron, screamed. Their screams echoed through the house. My cousin ran to grab the baby and came out in an instant. Neither Julissa nor Aaron could stop screaming. All rushed over, worried about the baby, thinking he had an accident, but slowly we understood what they were trying to say between their cries. A woman. There was a woman in the room looking at the baby. It took nearly half an hour for them to describe her. They said it was a woman sitting very straight, with her hands resting on her lap, in the chair facing my grandfather's bed. Someone then mentioned that when my grandfather used to talk to himself, he would often do so while looking at that particular chair. But honestly, I can't confirm that, because I never saw it myself. Maybe our fear at that moment made us connect the dots to make sense of what happened. We couldn't finish the evening there. We moved everything, food, gifts, to my uncle's house. 15 minutes away. That's a Christmas we'll never forget. It took place during Christmas of 1989. Back then, our neighborhood had several Romani families. They seemed like a group of people who barely spoke Spanish. Among them were women who would read fortunes at the market, while the men sold jewelry claiming it was gold, though it was clear they were just trinkets. My mom had a lot of respect for them, not fear per se, but a lot of caution. She was careful even in how she declined their fortune readings, always trying not to offend them. My sister and I found them fascinating. We imagined their stories and everything they must have gone through to get here. We would try to picture what their homes inside the neighborhood were like. On Christmas morning, my sister and I went out to the nearest store. The house was locked up, so we walked a little further, trying to find an open shop. Before reaching it, we turned a corner and ran into one of the Romani women, the one who scared me the most. She was about 50 years old, but gave off the impression of being very tough, strong, as if she had lived through many hardships. "Where are you going?" she asked us. We told her we were looking for something at the store. "Do you have a coin for me?" At that moment, we were too scared to say no. The street was completely empty, and we knew how cautious our mom was around them. My sister gave her a coin, even though we needed it. The woman pulled something out of a cloth bag and placed it in my sister's hands. "Thank you very much," she said and walked away, singing a song that wasn't in Spanish. It sounded very old, like something from a medieval movie. What she gave my sister was a rag doll barely larger than her hand. A truly ugly doll. We would have thrown it away right then and there if we didn't need to show it to our mom to explain why we hadn't brought everything back from the store. Christmas was quiet, but not that night, and not the next one. On the night of the 25th, footsteps woke my parents, but there was no one. The following night, the sounds came again. This time, they were sure it wasn't a coincidence. There was no explanation for them. Nothing like this had ever happened before. They checked on us to make sure neither my sister nor I had left our rooms. We told them we hadn't. "It's the doll," said my sister, still half asleep and getting out of bed. "It's the doll." My parents searched the entire house for the doll without success. They went back to sleep, thinking it was just a bad dream my sister had had. By morning, the doll was sitting in the living room on a chair like it was a person. Then they realized something was really strange. Both of them had passed by that chair several times the night before while looking for it, and there had been nothing there. My mom sought help. She was told the doll had to be sold, not just disposed of or given away. It had to be sold. A neighbor, someone more experienced in these matters, offered to buy it for a symbolic coin. After that, my mom never told us anything else about it. This memory, as I mentioned, had been buried among the things I managed to forget over the years through therapy. But recently, I'd started questioning it again. It's important to remember to be very aware of the things that exist, even if we'd rather believe they don't. In the 90s, when I was a child, this city was very different. It changed quickly. Back then, we walked a lot. It was something almost everyone did. The path to my Aunt Claudia's house, for example, wasn't too long, maybe 40 minutes. But we had to cross through a wooded area with a small lagoon in the middle. During rainy seasons, the area would turn lush and green, and the lagoon would come alive. It was actually quite beautiful, and something happened, and we were no longer allowed to go through the woods. None of the kids I knew were allowed anyway, but that year, it was an emergency. Aunt Claudia was very sick. She had already told us she would be spending Christmas alone. But on the 24th, as evening fell, she called to say she felt very unwell and needed medicine. The local doctor, who had known my mom and her family all their lives, helped us get the medicine so my siblings and I could take it to her. My mom stayed home preparing Christmas dinner. The only thing she thought prudent was for all three of us to go together, even if it meant crossing the woods. Several people crossed the woods that night, according to a memory. Although it was barely getting dark, the woods already looked menacing. Maybe it was because no one walked through them anymore. Or maybe it was the eerie silence that surrounded the area, despite the animals that supposedly lived there. I don't know if my memory is playing tricks on me, but I don't even remember the sound of a single bird that evening. As we approached the lagoon, we heard a voice in the distance. A man's voice, but we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Somewhere around this location was a town who was constant clamor at the top of my mind as I closed my eyes, focusing on the fallen trees and the cloud decaying further in the distance. A man's voice, but we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. When we reached the lagoon, we saw a figure crouched over the water, collecting something from it. Standing, it was a woman. We stopped in surprise, and the figure turned to look at us. He stood up, and I remember seeing him as enormous, abnormally tall. Though I was a child and couldn't accurately estimate height, at the time I thought he must have been 2 meters tall. He was also very large and imposing. He began approaching us slowly, holding a large jar in his hands. "You can't pass," he said. "Go back the way you came." We told him we had something important to deliver and didn't have time to go around the woods. He approached us slowly, and we seemed frozen in place. None of us ran because we instinctively knew that if we did, one of us might be left behind. We had to stay together. "What's in that bag?" he asked, looking at our paper bag with the medicine. "Bread," I said, with a bit of innocence. "I'll trade you," he said, showing us the contents of his jar. It was full of tadpoles, completely full of them. "It's not bread, it's medicine," my brother said. "We have to deliver it." The enormous man tightened his grip on his jar. I paid attention to his hair, poorly cut and shaved on the sides. He squeezed the jar as if angry. In that moment, I was sure he was calculating whether we were lying. I was calculating too, wondering if we would have a chance to defend ourselves if he attacked. Could we run? No, running wasn't sensible. If he caught one of us, there was no way we could fight back. "If you let us pass, I promise we'll come back with bread for you," I told him. His expression didn't change, but he stepped aside, watching us with suspicion. We passed by him, walking quickly. Once we had left him behind, we turned around and saw him walk back to the lagoon and release the tadpoles he had in the jar. When we got to Aunt Claudia's house, Agustin, family friend, was there. He had come to check on her. He offered to accompany us back so we wouldn't have to cross the woods alone. Agustin had a cart attached to his bicycle, which he used to collect scrap metal. It was empty at the time, so we all climbed in. We crossed the woods without seeing any trace of the man who had made us fear for our lives just a while earlier. I never went back with Brett, too afraid to see him again. Over time, I felt guilty, realizing he might have had a cognitive condition. That guilt stayed with me for years. Around 2014, an anthropologist published a small book documenting forgotten local legends, including one about a man emerging from the lagoon when it was lush and alive. Though my siblings and I'd never heard it before, I'm almost certain that night we encountered a living legend. Despite my efforts, I haven't found the book online. It must exist only in physical form.